All right, let's fix this garden because it has never really been right. Hey everyone, I'm Erin, the Impatient Gardener. I live and garden here in southeastern Wisconsin, Zone 6A. It is the middle of winter, which is a really good time to make some plans for what we're gonna do in spring. And one of the things I wanna do this year is deal with this garden behind me. So this is a little terraced bed that I created back in 2010 or 2011. I built that little stone wall. I'm pretty proud of that. And parts of this garden have worked, but other parts haven't. The timing on this is somewhat determined by the fact that I have once again decided to change out the centerpiece of this garden, which is this tree right here. And I'll pop up there in a second and walk you through everything. But it's a totally different take that we're gonna do. So that's moving, which opens up some opportunities to change a few other things. So let me hop up there, walk you around what we're keeping, what's leaving. It's not a big area. I'm gonna measure it out, but probably the area I'm changing is not more than 10 feet by 5 feet, something like that. It's a very small portion of this that I'm gonna change, but I definitely think it will be a change for the better. So let me start by walking you through what's here so that you can get an idea of what's staying and what's going. So the main thing that's going is this. This is a Salix purpurea pendula grafted willow. So it's a purple willow that's grafted onto the top of a rootstock here. And I don't love how messy it is. I mean, in terms of just the look, it doesn't actually provide a big mess like a giant weeping willow would or something. I really have to keep up with the suckers on it quite a bit. It also is affected usually by once a year, some sort of little larvae gets on there and eats the leaves up quite a bit. It's not that big of a deal. I don't do anything for it. Every once in a while I'll put a little neem oil on there, but it just looks a little bad for a while. This is the third tree that's been here. I've had a Jane magnolia in this spot before, and one other tree that I actually can't remember what it was that was here. But this is the third one, and I'm gonna hope that the fourth one is the charm in this area. So this is gonna go away. We'll see. It's not a bad little tree. We'll see when I dig it up if I'm able to transplant it somewhere, and if I am, great, and if I'm not, then that's okay too. This is going to get replaced with an evergreen. We'll talk a little bit more about that choice, but the important thing to know is that this is a very sort of columnar, semi-whimsical evergreen that's going to be here. So because this is now going to be an evergreen, that brings up to question this blue globe spruce that's right here. So this is one of 3 of these blue globe spruces. They were all planted at the same time when I did this bed. They've grown quite a bit. This may or may not stay. I don't know how I'm going to feel about 2 spruces right next to each other. I suspect it's not the right call, but that's up for debate. In front here are 3 June hostas. This is one of my favorite hostas. And this is a pretty sunny spot, so I am facing east right now. This is a pretty sunny spot. These hostas do fine here as long as they have enough water. So I don't see these going anywhere. I like the idea of keeping those. Right here, we've got a large collection of Millennium alliums. I also like that, however, very easy to move if I decide I need to. And then as we get over here, we enter mishmash territory. I do have on both sides of this wall, I do have clematis that I quite like that go over the wall. One is a pink one is sapphire indigo. So those are there, but from like this spot over, there's not a lot happening here. These limelight hydrangeas, love them, they're not going anywhere. As we come over this way, past these, there's sort of a random mix of, there's a rose there. There's sort of a random mix of things that are in here. There's some sedums that are in here. There is a tree peony that is not doing that well. And as you get back here, this area basically has nothing important in it. There is a clematis over here that I love. This is my gnome my gnome ginkgo, which I love. This will not go anywhere. And I think this is going to look so much better with the spruce that's coming here than this willow is right here. And then back here, I've got a hydrangea macrophylla. I think it's I forget which one it is, but it's actually a pretty good spot for one. It actually does bloom for me back there. And then beyond that, we're again into mishmash territory. Now, one thing to know is that, I'm gonna walk way back here and hope you can see. This door back here is the skirting to underneath our deck. And that swings, aches. And that swings open, and it's important that we retain access to that. So we can't have anything that we can't walk on there, can't have anything too tall there, because we need to be able to get under the deck, because we've got like a water hookup under there that's kind of crucial to the whole operation around here. So what we're basically talking about changing is this corner here, possibly this area, we'll decide about this, over here, over to basically to the ginkgo, and then we're good on the front there. So this is really not like a big garden redesign. This is more of a garden spruce up. But I don't know that I've ever designed this garden with a great deal of intention. Even when we originally did it, I knew there were some things I wanted to put into it, and it was kind of like, well, I'll fill it in with the rest of the stuff later, which is how you end up with a garden that isn't very good. We're going to kind of walk through this process together, because I thought it might be helpful, because I have to think that a lot of people have these spots in their garden that they just aren't happy with, or just aren't working for them, or have never really been right. And this is all three of those. So I'm going to take a couple of measurements. I'm going to take a few photos, and we're going to get to work on coming up with some design ideas for what we're going to do here. All right. Welcome to the design studio, which looks a lot like my kitchen, because it is. And that's fitting for a project like this, because unlike design projects where I'm starting in a totally new ungardened spot in my garden or somewhere else, this is a much less precise process for me, because I think there's a big difference between a new area where you really have to define all kinds of parameters, in addition to have a very specific dimensional design. When you're fixing up an area of your garden that's just not working for some reason, inherently you already know the answers to a lot of the questions that you would have when you're starting a new area. So for instance, if you're creating a new garden area, it's not a bad idea to have a physical checklist or a mental checklist of all the things you might need to know about that area, like sun exposure, how much sun is it getting from what angle at what time of day, what are the soil conditions like, what is the water or access to water situation, what sort of other garden challenges are presented in this area in terms of perhaps you've got a weed, or perhaps there's, you're next to a road and you've got traffic things you have to take into consideration. Those are all things when you're starting in a new garden that I think it's really helpful to think very carefully about. So a physical checklist and writing it down on paper can actually be really helpful, or at least have it in your mind. When you're fixing up an area that you've been gardening in and you know this area well, you inherently know the answers to those questions. So you don't actually have to, they're just part and parcel of what you're thinking. You don't have to spend a lot of time reminding yourself of those things, because you know it well, because you've already been working in this space for some time. And obviously I'm talking about a garden area that you're working on for yourself. If you're doing this for somebody else, obviously you need to be much more precise, because you actually have to make them understand what you're talking about here, and provide them a very realistic idea of what the final product is going to be. When you're just working on your own spaces, you are the client, so to speak. So you don't need to be particularly precise. And I find that to be helpful in these spaces, because especially when you're keeping some of the plants in the area, once you get the new plants into that area, you know things are going to have to shift and you're going to have to give a little bit. The same can be true for new garden areas too, but in particular, when you're just taking a small chunk of an area and fixing that and you're leaving a lot of existing elements, you got to be a little fluid because you know it's going to change once you're standing in that area with the plants in your hand. And there's one other thing that I don't take so seriously when it comes to this kind of garden spruce up design. And that is what the actual design looks like. I'm not saying what the design intent was. I'm saying the actual design. Because here's the thing, guys. I am not an artist. So what I have is a bunch of little like sketches and drawings and occasionally photos that I draw over or I superimpose images of plants on top of so that it makes sense in my brain or makes sense to someone else that I might need to show it to, like you guys. These are not works of art. So I think you should don't let that stop you. Like I would hate to see people say, I want to redesign this part of my garden and start by watching a bunch of YouTube videos on how to do the actual physical drawing. Because that is not the important part at all. What you need mostly is a piece of graph paper. If you don't have a piece of graph paper, you can create graph paper I do it on my iPad. So, but all you need is something to get some scale going. So graph paper works great. You can use a scale ruler, whatever those are called. You can do any of those things. But you don't need to be fancy about it if you are the only one who needs to understand the design. So, like I said, I do most of these designs on my iPad. I have done them on paper before. I do them on my iPad because my iPad is almost always with me. I use a program called Procreate, but you could do this in literally any program where you can draw on top of a piece of graph paper, which are many, 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 many. I like to use two different views for designing. I like to do a top-down view because I think this is how you get a better idea of spacing of plants. And then I like to do sort of a kind of rendering of standing in front of the garden and looking at it. In the case of this specific garden, the top-down view is actually particularly important because we actually view this garden as much from the top as we do from that angle that I was shooting the video from, because our deck is quite high. So we actually really do look down into this garden quite a bit. Those limelight hydrangeas, basically the flowers come to just like a few inches above the railing of the deck, meaning when you stand on our deck, the flowers are right here. You are like, your face is amongst them, which is great. I love it. That's why I chose them. And that's why I love having those there, because they are sort of one with the deck up there. Everything else in that garden, you sort of look down into. A lot of times top-down views are really helpful for designing a garden, like I said, for spacing. They aren't as important as standing amongst the garden is when it comes to how the design looks, because we aren't usually looking at our gardens from above unless you have sort of a second story situation. So when you're designing a garden, the view you typically want to worry about the most is the one that it looks like when you're standing on the ground looking at it. So I start with a piece of graph paper and then I draw in a few things. In this case, I've drawn in the sort of fixed elements here, and again, these are sketches. This is no work of art here. So I've drawn in the ginkgo. I've drawn in the Rosy Teacups dogwood, which was out of frame in that video, but is off to the right as you look at that video. It goes along, it's all part of that same garden, but it goes along the path out to the garage. And then I've drawn in more or less the location of the 3 limelight hydrangeas as well. A few of the other elements that we also talked about. And from there, we're going to start with kind of the main focal point of this whole garden and the whole reason why it's changing, basically, which is changing out that willow for the new evergreen. And that is going to be Picea armorica pendula bruns. This is a tree that instills strong feelings in people. It's got kind of a whimsical Seussian look to it. Sometimes they can lean over and create these really weird shapes. Sometimes they're quite upright. Sometimes they get like a little hitch. They kind of wivel around a little bit. And that last one is kind of what I'm hoping for mine. So it is probably not the right tree for everyone. It is probably the right tree for me. I'm quite excited about something that shakes up the formality that can come with a narrow, upright tree of any kind. So that is kind of the focal point. That's the main thing. So we're going to put that in. That gets slotted basically in the middle, pushed a little bit to the front of that border because since this is an east-facing garden, the sun, as it moves around, comes, obviously we're getting some east sun, but we're getting a lot from the south. And then as you get closer to the deck, we get into a bit more shade because, of course, the sun has to can't really bend around where the deck is there. All right, so now that we've identified where this new sort of focal point evergreen is going to go, we have to deal with some decision making on the blue globe spruce there. And the more I draw this out, the more I cannot make this garden make sense with that blue globe spruce in it. In addition to the fact that it's not really making sense, it's also it's kind of, it's in addition to the fact that I can't really wrap my head around this from a design standpoint, it's an older plant. And I have done a terrible job of doing anything to control in any meaningful way the size. So like if I wanted to keep this super tight, I should have been pinching back candles every single year to keep this nice and bushy and reduce the size of those candles. And it wouldn't be kind of splaying out all over. I still have 2 other ones of those along the path. And I still like those. Those are not going anywhere. And actually this third one was always planted to be the third partner in the triangle. But I feel like now that we have this other spruce coming in, I feel like we can get that repetition through not necessarily having the same plant, but the same kind of plant. Maybe I'm stretching there a little bit, but I don't think that's going to work there anymore. So I do think that I'm going to have to ditch that blue globe spruce and fill in that spot, because I think that blue globe spruce is going to only take away from what that pendula bronze might bring to the area. Now, the other parts that we've talked about keeping on this front edges, those 3 June hostas. And then we've got those alliums that are on the left side of that. I mentioned that we've got 2 clematis that fall over the wall. First thing we're gonna do is I know that I want cohesion here. We need some repetition. One of the problems with this bed is that there's just a lot of little things going on, which often happens for me when I don't have a clear plan going in. I end up doing a lot of throwing things in. So 3 of this and 3 of that. Anyway, move some of those alliums around. So I've drawn in sort of another area on the other side of that to create some balance there. Although I do not feel like we need symmetry here. That is not my goal, but balance is good. I don't need symmetry. And probably dot those around in other places in the garden as well, as just one of the main plants that's gonna kind of carry that through. But in order to sort of figure out this center front part of this, I need to figure out what's gonna go around that pendula bronze. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I think I've nailed exactly what I want there. I think I want this pendula bronze emerging up out of a sea of gold. So I'm looking for something low, because I don't want to hide the bottom of it. The shape of this tree is what's important, right? So I don't want tall perennials up against the bottom of that. So I sort of want this puddle of things underneath it. And I think the perfect plant for that is actually, well, perfect in most ways. I think the perfect plant for that is juniper, a shore juniper called all gold. This is a zone 6 plant. I am technically a zone 6. That rosy teacups dogwood that I have in that garden is often listed as a zone 6 plant as well. I think this is a protected little spot, and I think there's a good chance those all gold junipers will grow there if I can find them. So those create, there's a very soft juniper, nice chartreuse color. I love a chartreuse moment. They're not like pokey junipers. They have kind of a softer, more feathery look to them. I think the height on them is somewhere in the 6-inch to 12-inch range and can spread out quite far over time, but you can prune those to keep those as wide as you want them. So I feel like now we've got that front center all taken care of. The next problem I need to solve, and this is where my brain goes on this, is what problem are we solving here other than just not liking what's there? And that problem is what goes in front of those limelight hydrangeas to hide the bare legs of them, because those bare legs are out there. And I don't want anything too blobby there. I want something with a little bit of movement to it. I want something with some shape to it. So this is, for me, I would not want something like a boxwood there. That is too much heaviness right there. So I came up with 2 plants that, for the time being, that I think would work there. Oh, and I'm looking for something maybe in the 36 inches tall range, give or take. We've got flexibility on height there, but that's sort of a range. I came up with 2 things. The first is a Durvilla, a bush honeysuckle, perhaps like the Kodiak orange, or I think there's an improved Kodiak red, one of those, I don't know which one it is, but one of those could be quite interesting. Certainly grows well in basically any condition you can put it in. Obviously that's going to be mostly a foliage accent. They do get some small flowers on them, but you don't really grow those for flowers. Can be pruned into any size you really want them to, and could be quite a nice, and so would certainly do a good job of obscuring those hydrangea legs. The other thing I came up with was Baptisia, which Baptisia, or Baptisia, I'm not sure. We say it whichever way you want. They're all right. You know what plant I'm talking about. That is a perennial that looks like and behaves like a shrub in many ways. It looks, it obviously gets quite large, sort of nicely vase shaped. It also looks great throughout the winter. It gets these really beautiful seed pods on it. There's a lot of winter interest with Baptisia. Tough plant, big, deep-rooted plant. Grows best in full sun, or I should say flowers best in full sun. But it does still work in part sun. You probably aren't going to have the same amount of flowering that you would in a full sun situation, but you can definitely push it into part sun. And I also happen to love the foliage of them. They have foliage that tends to be just a slightly bit of blue, but really nice texture, beautiful shape on the leaves. A very interesting plant during the rest of the time when it's not flowering. And I think the bloom time on Baptisia is probably about a month, maybe a little bit more. So you do want to make sure that it's going to look good other than just those flowers. Now the one that I've sort of spec'd for this is Lemon Meringue. Happens to be the Proven Winners Landscape Plant of the Year. And I picked it because it's got bright yellow flowers on it, which I think will help brighten up that back corner. Because that corner is a little distant, I don't want to put a dark plant back there because I feel like it's just going to recede and look very dark and kind of unwelcoming. Not that a corner has to be welcoming, but I think it's much better to brighten that corner up. Plus that yellow should refer back nicely to the all gold juniper. Also, I recognize that there is an opportunity here for me to plant more of one of my very favorite plants, which is clematis, my probably original plant obsession, and I look for opportunities to put more clematis in the garden all the time. And I think that clematis, Stand By Me lavender, I grow the blue one, but lavender would be particularly good there. I also like lavender flowers because I feel like they brighten up darker areas. Lavender flowers are a little bit opalescent almost to me, and so they behave somewhat like white flowers do, in my opinion, in the garden and create a little bit of brightness. And I think that would help break up any sort of blockiness that might come from the Baptisia. I also think Stand By Me, which only gets 34 inches tall or something, you do have to provide a little bit of support, but it also would scramble a little bit through the Baptisia and sort of intermingle in that, and I think that is a look I want. And this is where sort of laying this out in that front on view is quite helpful, because I think in this specific case, it's quite important that I've got plants going from short to tall. And that's not how I like everything. I'm actually quite a proponent of putting tall plants near the front of garden borders. But in this case, I think it makes sense because we're trying to A, obscure a little bit of the underskirting of the deck there, but B, because this is a raised terraced garden bed, if you have plants that are shorter than others, shorter behind taller plants, particularly when you're standing on the ground looking at it, those are really going to be obscured. You're not going to be able to see over the other plants because we're already up 18 inches or so maybe in that garden. So I think it is important that I want this gradual, I do want in this case a short to tall situation. And what we have here is a pretty big gap between the height of that Baptisia or the Durvilla, and let's say it's 34 to 36 inches, and the 14-inch tall allium with nothing in between those two. And this is the part when I look at this picture where I start thinking about what other shapes of foliage or flowers do we need. So we've got the little balls with the allium, which kind of create a bit of a cloud. When the Baptisia is in flower, we've got some really nice spike flowers. So what shape of flower are we kind of missing there? An umbellifer certainly would be nice there, but so would something kind of a round flower. And so when I think about part sun and I think about round flowers, tall garden phlox becomes kind of a pretty good option, I think. And certainly those come in a lot of colors and a lot of heights. There is kind of a mid-range height of them that's probably can be in that 24 inches tall range, which I think might look good there. What I don't want to do is introduce any bright pinks into this. I think we've got kind of a muted, we've got kind of lavenders and golds happening here so far. So I think a purple or a blue would work really well there, and that would stand out against whatever is behind it, and because we're not too far back in the corner that we're going to lose those flowers. I also think a white could potentially work, although white can be challenging in the garden. It really is in your face, and so white can sometimes be really disturb the flow of your eye a little bit. There are some of these phlox that have like white with like a lavender eye on them. They're not like a full bright white necessarily, so that could work. So those can kind of go in between there and then wrap around the pendula bruns in the back, and that kind of handles that whole side of that design. On the other half, I've already mentioned that I'm probably going to remove the tree peanuts there. I think I can just pick up the phlox and the allium and sort of mix that in that area. The only other thing I might consider adding in there, because I think we might need something to break up everything, is actually another hosta. I wouldn't go out and buy a new hosta. I've got so many beautiful hostas on this property that I can divide, that it doesn't, and those divisions will grow faster than anything I could buy. I think I'll know when I'm standing in that space whether I need that break of the bold foliage in there. A, it'll create some cohesion because we've got the June hostas at the front. But B, I think it might provide a nice little break kind of in the center of that side. And that's important because the other way that part of this garden is viewed is actually from the patio. If you watch my videos and my tours in summer, you see this view all the time. This is right by our back steps, which is the main way we come in and out of the house. It's right along where we go down the path to get to the garage. It is one of the most frequently viewed areas in the garden. And I plant up the front of that bed a little differently every year with annuals, and I like playing with annuals in that space. I actually think of that section sort of towards the front of the patio as a different garden than everything else I'm talking about here, because you can't see that spot when you're standing down on the lawn where I shot the opening part of this video from, and you can't see the part that I'm redesigning here from standing on the patio. To me, that little section along the edge of the patio there by the back steps needs to work in concert with the rest of what's planted around the rest of the patio rather than what's planted in that same garden. Having a hosta in between those two areas would actually be a really nice visual break to sort of delineate those two areas and just create a nice little resting moment for your eye before you move on to the next thing. Just a quick note on some of the color selections here. to remind you of what is in front of that wall. A couple of years ago, I ripped out basically everything that was it a couple of years ago? Yeah. That was in front of that wall, and basically did a mass planting of lady's mantle. One of my go-to plants. Absolutely love it. There's a few other things. There's some nepeta that's growing up between that. And actually the nepeta that's there is cat's meow. And I am probably going to replace the nepeta because it's sort of spaced throughout there at regular intervals to create a little bit of repetition. Probably going to replace that with lemon perfection, which is one of the newer chartreuse foliage ones from Proven Winners. And I think I'm going to do that. So now we've got this chartreuse repetition here. I talk about chartreuse a lot in the garden. It's a big deal to me. I was watching a garden design tour the other day with somebody who said, I don't really like chartreuse in the garden at all. And I was suddenly reminded that not everybody loves chartreuse. So clearly it's a personal thing. So you would have the chartreuse flowers of the lady's mantle in front. You've got the chartreuse of the all gold juniper in the back. You add in that lemon perfection nepeta kind of dotted through there, which has that sort of chartreuse foliage. So even once the flowers from the lady's mantle is finished flowering and it's just green foliage, you'll have some chartreuse coming up throughout that. This all refers back to what's happening in the bed behind it. And suddenly I feel like we've got this whole area, instead of looking at this as two separate gardens, we've got this as one larger garden that just happens to have a terraced wall in it. So like I said, this sort of fix-up style of garden design, I look at much differently than starting from scratch. And everything I just said could change. If I can't find these plants, these specific plants I've talked about, I'll substitute with something else. But the key part is that by drawing this out, I've got a much better idea of what I need where. For instance, I need something to hide the bare legs of the limelights. And we need a stepping plant in between there. And they don't have to be the ones that I've just talked about, but I know if I can't get those or I change my mind on those, I know what I'm looking for in a plant, which is hugely helpful to narrow that down by visually seeing it on either this sort of the overhead view or some sort of straight on view to get an idea of what that looks like. So I hope that helped you sort of walk through if you're dealing with some areas in your garden that are that you just have to fix up. They're not quite right. This is how I go about doing that. And I would encourage you to sketch something. Do whatever you need to do so that you force yourself into recognizing what the problem is, first of all, because sometimes you don't know, you just know it doesn't feel right. Identifying each specific need, and then you can kind of move from there. And by drawing it out, I think that's how you get there. So I hope you found that helpful. If you did, leave me a comment. I'm happy to do more types of videos like this if this is helpful to you, or if it's not, I won't. And I'd love to actually hear about some of the areas of your garden that you're starting to think about now that you want to tackle in spring, and what you're planning on doing there. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe if you hadn't. I always appreciate the support, and I hope you have a great day in your garden. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.